5 points or so of the SPGB. We agree that capitalism is the system that dominates the world everywhere today. Every country in the world is capitalist, including all the so-called socialist countries. We agree that as long as capitalism exists, there will be a class struggle between the two antagonistic classes, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. We agree that this class struggle can only have one resolution, which is socialism. And despite one or two criticisms of the definition that appears in the SPGB's publications, we agree broadly that socialism is indeed a world, stateless, moneyless society without frontiers and so on, without wage labour or commodity production. And we reject completely all the so-called socialist organisations of the left who actually have a program of state capitalism, the Communist Party, the Trotskyists and so on. We agree that the emancipation of the working class will bring with it the emancipation of the whole of humanity. And we agree that the emancipation of the working class can only be carried out by the whole working class itself, and it can't be done by a minority on behalf of the working class. In a sense, these basic principles have been the foundations of Marxism from the very beginning. But Marxism is not a fixed creed of static principles. It's the theoretical elaboration of the real movement of the working class, a class which can learn only through its own experience and struggle. Those who are able to understand the lessons of this experience of the working class are the continuators of Marx's method, and are able to help clarify the content of the socialist program. Those who are unable to grasp these lessons either end up passing over to the other side of the barricades, to the bourgeoisie, or they end up as sclerotic sects who are unable to add anything to the understanding of the working class while not entirely deserting the camp of the working class. It's our contention that the SPGB suffers from this disease of sclerosis, and that this disease could indeed lead it to going over to the bourgeoisie in the revolutionary upheavals that lie ahead.
Can someone close the outer door, please?
Is this so much?
It's supposed to be working, I don't.
You're not working, they're just for show. Oh, I'll try and speak louder. Marxism, if you like, began with the basic affirmation of the struggle between the two classes in capitalist society, and affirmed that this conflict could only be resolved in a classless society. But the actual road which would lead to this society was extremely hazy at the beginning of Marxism, the time when Marx and Engels wrote the Communist Manifesto. And the reason for that was that the working class itself had not really set foot on the road that led to socialism. For example, in the Communist Manifesto we find that the economic measures advocated by Marx, by the Communist League, would, like the stratification of capital, the centralization of capital in the hands of the state, would, if put in practice today, simply lead to a situation of state capitalism. And in this sense they represented the immaturity of the workers' movement at that time. Similarly, the political program outlined in the Communist Manifesto, the idea that the working class would take hold of the old capitalist state and use it for its own purposes, also reflected the immaturity of the working class struggle at that epoch. And it was the subsequent experience of the working class that led Marx to reconsider this basic political affirmation in the Communist Manifesto. In 1848, the insurrections in Paris of the French workers allowed Marx to begin to understand the need for the working class not to struggle to take over the old state machine, but to struggle against it. As he wrote in the 18th of Brumaire, in its struggle against the revolution, the parliamentary republic found itself compelled to strengthen, along with the repressive measures, the resources and centralization of governmental power. All revolutions perfected this machine instead of smashing it. Reflecting on the same experience in a letter to Kugelmann in 1871, Marx repeated this. He said, "If you look at the last chapter of my 18th Brumaire, you will find that the next attempt at the French Revolution will be no longer as before to transfer the bureaucratic and military machine from one hand to another, but to smash it. And this is the preliminary condition for any real people's revolution on the continent. And this is what our heroic party comrades in Paris are attempting." The last statement is, of course, referring to the Paris Commune, which was then in full swing. And for Marx and Engels, the number one lesson of the Paris Commune was precisely, as they said in the later introduction to the Communist Manifesto, one thing especially was proved by the Commune: the working class cannot simply lay hold of the ready-made state machinery and wield it for its own purposes. And so important was this lesson for Marx and Engels that in the later introduction to the manifesto, they stressed it as the main alteration that would be necessary in if the Communist Manifesto would be rewritten in the 1880s or 90s. The need to destroy the old state machine and institute a new one, a new form of political power which, unlike the old one, could provide a framework for working out the emancipation of labour. And as Marx underlined in the Civil War in France, this was a state that abolished parliamentarism. The Commune, he wrote, was to be a working, not a parliamentary body, executive and legislative at the same time. It broke up the standing army and bureaucracy and made it possible for the proletariat to control its delegates. Now, the Paris Commune of 1871 was in many ways, although a crucial lesson of working class struggle, it was a lesson for the future. Socialism could not have been instituted in that period. Capitalism had not yet become a world system. And while it was still expanding across the world, the workers' movement had no choice but to organise to struggle for reforms through Parliament and through the trade unions, reforms that were possible in that epoch and therefore necessary to struggle for. But the fact that the workers' movement gave so much energy to struggling for reforms inevitably had a corrosive and corrupting effect on its parties. Reformism and what was called revisionism grew up throughout the Second International in the parties of social democracy. And the ideas came that capitalism would gradually reform itself into socialism, that revolution was no longer necessary because capitalism could solve its economic problems, and that it was enough to elect a majority of workers' parties of workers' delegates into parliament to either gradually reform capitalism out of existence or institute socialism by decree. It's also worth pointing out that it was always the parliamentary delegates of the social democracy who tended to be the worst revisionists and the worst reformists, and this of course wasn't accidental. And these reformist ideas, these illusions in Parliament, which the revolutionaries at that time called parliamentary cretinism, affected even the most clear elements in the working class, even Marx and Engels themselves. Engels began to forget the lessons of the Paris Commune and to bring back the idea of the working class taking power by electing a party to parliament and instituting socialism in this way. And even Marx hinted that this might be a possibility in some countries, although neither Marx and Engels even considered the possibility that such a takeover of power could happen without violent confrontations with the old ruling class. However, it's important to understand how deeply these illusions affected the working class movement as a whole. If we turn to the origins of the Socialist Party of Great Britain, we can see that it was on one hand, when it emerged in the early 1900s, a healthy reaction against these reformist ideas, the reformist degeneration of the Second International from which it broke. But the fact that it attacked the reformism of the Second International did not mean that it could really break from all the errors of the Second International. And in particular, the erroneous views about taking power through Parliament were inherited by the SPGB. It too was affected by the general amnesia which had led the working class movement to forget the lessons of 1871. And because of the very strong tendencies towards sectarianism right from the beginning of the SPGB, the conviction that it alone understood the socialist programme, a sectarian disease which has continued ever since its existence began, it was unable to grasp the lessons of the class struggle in the period that was opening up at the time of its foundation. The great experience of 1905 in Russia, in which the working class first threw up the Soviets and new forms of struggle of the mass strike, completely passed the SPGB by. It was completely unable to see that a new period of struggle was opening up for the working class, in which all the old methods of struggle were completely outplayed and reactionary. And this inability to grasp the lessons of the new period were even more marked during the Russian Revolution and the revolutionary wave which followed and spread throughout Europe in reaction to the First World War. The SPGB, although at the beginning, and this is worth pointing out, the SPGB felt a certain sympathy for the Russian Revolution and saw it as a heroic attempt of the workers of Russia, rather like the Commune, very quickly the SPGB turned its back on the experience of the Russian workers refused to express its solidarity with them, and took up the completely erroneous arguments of the Mensheviks that socialism was not possible in Russia because it was a backward economy, ignoring completely what the revolutionaries of the time were saying, that the October Revolution, the seizure of power by the working class in Russia, was not instituted with the aim of building socialism in Russia alone, but was the first step in a world proletarian revolution, because only on a world scale could socialism be built. And before very long, the SPGB had completely abandoned the initial solidarity it may have felt with the Russian workers, and argued erroneously, because the new period made capitalist revolutions a historic impossibility, that the Russian Revolution was nothing but a capitalist revolution. And it's not surprising at the same time that they stopped celebrating the Commune as well, in 1918, I believe. The Commune was no longer seen by the SPGB as something to learn from for the working class. However, the real movement which millions and millions of workers were throwing themselves into in Europe, in Russia and elsewhere, showed that indeed a new period of capitalism had been born, the period of proletarian revolution. And everywhere the workers' struggle confronted the old forms and institutions, unions, parliament and social democracy, and were building new forms of struggle which corresponded to the interests of the revolutionary struggle, the workers' councils and communist parties. And it was in response to this movement that Lenin and other revolutionaries were able to reaffirm the old lessons which Marx and Engels had defended so strongly, of the need to completely destroy the old bourgeois state and replace it with new organs of power. And these organs of power, as the workers themselves were showing, were the workers' councils. The Russian Revolution ended in defeat, of course, but it wasn't the SPGB which was able to analyze why the Russian Revolution had been defeated. On the contrary, only those elements who had expressed their solidarity with it in initial phases, when it was still a proletarian revolution, were able to understand and contribute something to understand why it had failed. And these were the left communists who were gradually expelled or left the Third International when it degenerated. People like the German, Dutch and Italian left. It's true that after the Russian Revolution, along with the left communists, the SPGB continued to defend against all the phony visions of socialism put forward by the now capitalist communist parties. It continued to say what socialism was, and it continued to impose imperialist wars, despite a number of vacillations on Spain, for example. But it was unable really to give any understanding to the new period that opened up, and unable to really take up a revolutionary opposition to imperialist wars. And so, although the SPGB managed to keep, in some ways, a flag of socialism flying in these years, it's the communist left from whom the ICC takes its traditions, because they were the ones who were able to clarify what the real lessons of the new period were. I'll now try, having given that basic outline of where we think we come from and where we think the SPGB came from, I'll try to go more deeply into the question, the basic question of which way to socialism, and why we think the SPGB's way to socialism is either, at best, a fantasy, and at worst, a way of reorganizing capitalism. If I may briefly sum up what appears to be the SPGB's vision of how socialism is going to come about, it says that we'll get socialism when the majority of the working class is sufficiently educated, mainly perhaps thanks to the untiring educational efforts of the SPGB, and perhaps with a little help from the crisis of capitalism. The working class, having realized the need to have socialism, will then either join or vote for the SPGB to go to Parliament, where its mandated socialist delegates will simply abolish wage labour and commodity production, overnight perhaps, although the SPGB never tire of telling us that people have got to be awake when socialism happens. This is fair enough, but we'll go into this, why this description is somewhat inadequate. First of all, the SPGB have no understanding at all of the relationship between the present struggles of the working class and the development of socialist understanding. Their view of the way consciousness develops in the working class is essentially a pedagogic one. They see it in terms of the SPGB, perhaps, converting each worker as a worker into becoming a socialist. And when we've got enough socialists, we'll be able to have socialism. They don't see, as Marx pointed out many, many times when he tried to show why the working class was the revolutionary class, that it's the struggle of the working class itself that leads it to develop a socialist understanding, that its mass revolutionary consciousness develops out of mass struggles of the class. Struggles which may begin as economic struggles, but which in certain conditions are forced to become political struggles, are forced to become struggles in which the working class becomes aware of the need to overthrow capitalism and build a new society. The SPGB does not see any connection between the struggles that are going on today and the future struggle for socialism. Therefore, they can make the horrible mistake of considering that the trade unions are still working class organisations. And in a recent article on Grunix, they advised Len Murray to go back to his job for which he's paid for, i.e. representing the working class, and keep out of politics, which shows a complete failure to understand that the job of Len Murray is precisely to control the working class and to politically dominate the working class on behalf of the capitalist state. They also think, of course, that Parliament and elections can be vehicles for developing the consciousness of the working class, that the working class can indeed express a socialist consciousness through participating in Parliament and elections. In reality, elections and Parliament, far from expressing the consciousness of the working class, atomize the working class, fragment it into a mass of amorphous citizens, dilute it amongst the rest of the population which has no objective interest in socialism. They reinforce illusions in the working class that we're living in a society which is really democratic. And it's the fact that these illusions that are spread by participating in Parliament no longer can do anything but prevent the working class from developing a socialist consciousness, that communists today oppose all participation in Parliament and in elections. In order to develop its consciousness, the working class has to struggle, and its struggle has to take an organised form. And this organisation of the class, the self-organisation, can only be on a basis which regroups the whole class, where the class expresses itself as a class. In other words, at the point of production, where the workers are defined collectively as workers. These organs, assemblies, factory committees, strike committees, and in revolutionary confrontations, workers' councils, allow the whole class to participate in the struggle and not passively sit back, which is the only way that one can participate in parliamentary elections. Of course, the consciousness of the working class is also expressed through the formation of political parties. But a party, by definition, can only be a part of the working class. The job of a working class party is not to take power or represent the class. And contrary to both what the old Social Democrats, the Bolsheviks, and the SPGB thought, the SPGB says, quoting from the Socialist Standard of October 1974, that the only form of organisation which can take political power is a political party. The SPGB may say that this means that one day all the workers will be in the Socialist Party of Great Britain, or at least a great majority of them. But in any case, this is in fact a version of the old mistake of substitutionism, the idea that a party can take power on behalf of the working class. And we completely reject this idea. We say that only the working class as a whole can take political power. The fact that the SPGB separates the real struggles of the working class, the struggles against exploitation, from the revolutionary struggle, means that it has a completely fantastic idea of what the revolution will be like. It thinks the revolution will be a respectable and orderly affair. And when one reads the SPGB's version of how socialism is going to come about, one is reminded of Engels' words. Have these gentlemen ever seen a revolution? It is the act whereby one part of the population imposes its will upon the other part by means of rifles, bayonets, and cannon. In the explanation of their basic principles, the SPGB says that socialism can't come out of a civil war. And they're able to say this by saying that a civil war can only be a minority imposing its will on the mass of the class, and that a minority cannot dragoon the class into socialism. This is, of course, true. The workers can't be dragooned into socialism. It's true that the working class has long gone beyond the old Blankist methods of a small minority seizing power on behalf of the working class. In order to have socialism, you must have a majority of the class conscious of the need for socialism. But even with all these factors, civil war between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie is inevitable. Capitalism is the most brutal and most violent class society in history, and it won't give up without a fight. History shows that you can only win over those elements who work for the capitalist state by the most resolute class struggle. The example of the women of Paris, the workers of Paris, who disarmed the guards who were sent to take their guns away from them, is a classic example of this. Only by struggling on their own terrain can the workers win over those forces of the state who are there to repress them. It's not a question of revolutionaries glorifying violence. In fact, the more conscious and the more organized the working class is, the less violence it will need. The point is, however, that it is criminal to spread illusions in the possibility of a peaceful revolution. In order to avoid getting massacred by the bourgeoisie, the workers themselves must be armed, and Marx insisted on this many, many times. For example, when he was writing about the class struggles in 1848 and again in 1871. The SPGB may reply that they are indeed prepared to use what they call the armed forces to suppress a violent anti-socialist minority once they've got power. But as I've tried to point out before, the lesson of the Paris Commune is precisely that the old machinery of the state cannot be taken over and used. The bourgeois state is not an empty vessel that can be used for any purpose whatsoever. Its form is dictated by its function. It is inherently an oppressive organ, an organ for exploitation and oppression. And this is why, whenever the workers go into struggle, they are forced to struggle outside of and against the state and not inside it. This is true from 1871, in 1905 when they set up the Soviets, and today in any strike when the workers have to struggle outside the trade unions. Because the working class revolution is the first revolution in history which doesn't aim to set up a new form of exploitation, it's impossible, like the bourgeoisie could, to take over the old state. It has to be destroyed. It may be true that Engels had the idea that at least some parts of the old state machine could be taken over and that you could lop off what he called the worst bits, i.e. that Parliament, because it was a democratic form, could be taken over by the workers and then they'd lop off the bureaucratic and military parts of the state. This was a wrong understanding then, and it's an absurdity today. In this epoch of capitalism, the epoch of capitalist decay, everywhere Parliament has ceased to have any real power. Real power is passed outside Parliament, and every state is essentially a regime of totalitarian state capitalism, whether we're talking about the Eastern Bloc countries or the Western Bloc. Parliament is there simply as a facade to cover over the really repressive face of the state. If you look at Britain, where the real power of decisions are taken, it's outside Parliament, in the army, in the executive, in the cabinet, anything but Parliament. And the easy way in which the bourgeoisie, even in Britain, dispensed with Parliament in 1926 or 1939 should convince anyone of this. However, even if Parliament was not the complete shell, the complete facade that it is, even if it had real power, the workers could not use it. As I've said before, the form of Parliament is hostile to the working class developing its consciousness because it breaks the working class up. Elections break the working class up into a mass of atomized citizens. It's impossible for the working class to exercise political power through Parliament. Leaving aside the fact that the bourgeoisie, of course, will be represented in any Parliament, the workers can only take political power through organs which regroup it as a class. This is why the Paris Commune was a higher form of power than Parliament, and this is why the workers' councils are a higher form still than the Commune, precisely because they are based on the class organising itself as a class. Only those organs which allow the whole class to participate in the taking of decisions, to control the delegates that they elect. Parliamentary delegates can't be recalled, they can't be controlled from outside, they can't even be mandated. The only other way of controlling these parliamentary delegates would be through the party. And once again we have the old mistake that the party's role is to substitute for the class in the construction of socialism. And just as the working class needs its own class organs to take political power, it must have its own class organs to reorganize production and create socialism. The taking of political power by the working class is only the first step towards socialism. The real transformation of social relations involves mass activity by the working class on an international scale. It needs the direct taking over of the means of production by the producers. It means breaking down the separation between the producers and the means of production. It means the setting up of organs which fuse political, social and economic tasks. And again, forms such as the workers' councils are alone able to do this. Parliament is completely unable to do this. It's a national form, even in those few countries of the world where it even exists. It's totally separated from the producers. It has no relationship to the working class as a class. The SPGB never tried to show how having parliamentary delegates, simply electing a number of parliamentary delegates, will abolish wage labour. The abolition of wage labour is an enormous social transformation on a worldwide scale, and it's a fantasy to think that by having a few people in Parliament and passing any decree you like, wage labour will disappear. Wage labour will only disappear by the conscious self-activity of the working class, and this means working class organisation. The SPGB never, of course, considers the international problems of the revolution. The fact that the working class is still a minority of the world's population on a world scale. The fact that socialism cannot exist even for a single moment in one country is never considered by the SPGB. None of these questions are answered by the SPGB in their attempts to describe how socialism will come about. And the reason for this is that their vision of socialism is a fantasy which will never happen. I might say that even if it did happen, that for some impossible reasons, the working class decided one day to elect the SPGB into Parliament, the SPGB, despite all its good intentions, which we don't doubt, would end up being fused into the bureaucratic machine of the state. With all the best intentions of the world, it would be the state and the national economy which would impose its will on the SPGB and would lead the SPGB to instituting a regime of state capitalism. But however, this is, as I said, a fantasy. It's not going to happen like this. What is going to happen? In the last 10 years or so, we've been living in a period of re-emerging class struggle. The capitalist crisis has reappeared in all its brutality, and the working class all over the world has responded to this, indicating that once again humanity is faced directly with the choice between socialism or barbarism, the communist revolution or another world war. It's by struggling against the attacks that capitalism is forced to mount on it, the working class will gradually see the need to wage a political struggle against the system, to institute a new social order. And revolutionaries have a crucial role to play in this. And in the mass struggles that open up on a world scale, and are already opening up, as in Spain, for example, the bourgeoisie will respond by trying to put forward democracy as a way of preventing the working class from struggling for its own interests. As it did in 1919 in Germany, for example, as it's doing in Spain and elsewhere today. It will try to get the workers to abandon their own struggle and to subordinate their own organs of struggle to democracy and to parliament. And it's in these moments that will be facing us in the not too distant future, that the SPGB will be faced with a crucial choice which will determine whether or not it's going to remain a working class organisation. In these struggles in which millions of workers will be confronting the whole apparatus of democracy, in which the whole of the bourgeoisie will be screaming at the working class, stop these horrible minority violent struggles, be sensible and subordinate yourself to the democratic will of Parliament, what will the SPGB say then? Will it be able to throw off its old dogmas that it's held for so many years and participate in the mass struggle of the class? Or will it join in this hypocritical chorus of the bourgeoisie? Will it tell the workers to stop this useless struggle, to have a sensible, British, orderly struggle for socialism through Parliament? Unfortunately, in times like this, there's no room for vacillation. At times when the class lines are drawn so clearly, like they were in October 1917, which we at least will be celebrating as a victory of the working class, there is no middle way between either the violent dictatorship of the bourgeoisie or the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat.
I now call upon E. Hardy, the SPGB, to
Well, Mr. Chairman, comrades, I shall say what my opponent said, that there's a lot of ground to be covered, and it won't be possible to cover all of it. A lot of these things that you have listened to, I mean, that this alleged belief of the SPGB that you can have socialism in one country, or this alleged belief that all you've got to do is to send people to Parliament, I mean, this is just nonsense, has no relation whatever to the case of the SPGB. But I will hope to deal with our case and the case put forward by ICC in their written propaganda, stage by stage, in order to bring out the real essence of it. I want to make a reference at first to Marx and Engels. The SPGB stands on its own feet. Our case is our own. But we're very much indebted to what Marx and Engels wrote, and I noticed that my opponent made a number of quotations from Marx about in support of their case. What I am going to show is that while we, the SPGB, have built our case, developed it further from the mature views that Marx and Engels reached after 50 years of experience, political experience, that the ICC are taking the views of the immature Marx and Engels. And I shall hope to develop that case. I'll just say one thing. You will have heard my opponent refer to the dictatorship of the proletariat. The dictatorship of the proletariat was invented by a Frenchman, Louis Blanqui, who staged his first attempt at it in 1830. And the ICC are living back in 1830. They haven't noticed what has happened to the world since. I want to just refer briefly, and I think I'm not quite sure whether my opponent accepts this. Socialism as a working system of society has got to be based on voluntary understanding, cooperation by the mass of the population. You cannot have socialism until that understanding and willingness to cooperate is there. As I say, I'm not quite sure whether they're really accepting that, because when I read some of their written propaganda, they do not seem to have seen the implications of it. So the question arises is this. If you are going to hope to achieve socialism, as understood by Marx and the SPGB, that is, a system of society in which there is no production for the market, no buying and selling, no wage labour, no prices, no armed frontiers, and all the rest of it, that you've got to have your working class mentally equipped and experienced to do it before you can have that socialism operated. So the question arises, how does the working class become equipped to take on this great task? There are two rival theories. Louis Blanqui, the view put forward by my opponent, was that you have a minority seizure of power, and your minority of seizure of power then educates the working class to introduce socialism later on. And in case my opponent thinks that, or he said they are not in favour of a minority, I shall quote various statements from their publications in which, whether they have seen it or not, they are committed to undertaking minority action. But the later mature views of Marx and Engels, I will read to you from Engels, 1895, just before he died, in his preface, his introduction to Marx's class struggles in France. I quote from Engels, "The time is past for revolutions carried through by small minorities at the head of unconscious masses. When it gets to be a matter of the complete transformation of the social organization, the masses themselves must participate, must understand what is at stake and why they are to act. That much the history of the last 50 years has taught us. But so that the masses may understand what is to be done, long and persistent work is required. Socialists realize more and more that no durable success is possible unless they win over in advance the great mass of the people, which in this case, he happened to be referring to France, means the peasants. The slow task of propaganda and parliamentary activity are here also recognized as the next task of our party." I shall refer again, you notice he refers to parliamentary activity, I shall refer again to this question of the peasants. And I want to emphasize that this is not an academic question. ICC write favorably of what happened in Russia in 1917 of Lenin, whatever they may think about anything that he may have done later. ICC are rejecting the view I led out to you, the Marxist view, that you've got to win over the mass of the population first before you attempt to attain power. ICC says, no, you don't wait for that. That's an illusion, they think. Well, I want to put a question to them. They are admirers of Lenin. Lenin made his position perfectly clear. Lenin was not going to wait for the majority of the working class. Lenin said the mass of the workers are only capable of trade union consciousness. They are not capable of what he called social democratic consciousness, that is, of understanding socialism. Lenin said that the development of socialist ideas come, and I quote from Lenin's What Is to Be Done, not written towards the end of Lenin's life, but in 1903, they come from the educated representatives of the propertied classes, the intelligentsia. And he pinpointed this with that well-known statement of his, if socialism can only be realized when the intellectual development of all the people permits it, then we shall not see socialism for at least 500 years. I want to put a question to my opponent. They are not going to do what the SPGB says. The SPGB says, like Engels, you've got to win over the great mass before you seize power, because otherwise it's useless. Why does ICC reject the possibility of winning over the working class? Is it, like Lenin, that they just think the working class are not capable of it, that you've got to wait 500 years even if then? Now, the second great obstacle to getting socialism, after you have won over people to understand socialism so that they could voluntarily cooperate in running a system of society, is this question of the machinery of government and the armed forces. The SPGB says you've got to get control of the machinery of government and the armed forces before you can do anything. This, of course, you will find Marx putting all over the place, putting it in capital and so on, and saying that you've got to get control of the organized force of society before you can do anything. Now, the SPGB's view is simply this, that you've got to win over your great mass of your population first, have them consciously and politically organized, as we say in our Declaration of Principles, and that they will send delegates to Parliament and councils and take over this machine. Now, I'm not going to say anything more at this moment. I shall come back to it. My opponent thinks this is quite impossible, that you can't do it. They use the argument, before I leave this, by the way, my opponent did refer to what Marx said in the Civil War in France as a result of the experience of the Paris Commune. But he didn't quite give you the full story of what Marx did say. Marx didn't say to the working class, you don't need to get control of the machinery of government and the armed forces. The words he used were that the workers cannot simply lay hold of it. Meaning, as he went on to say, they have got to lay hold of it, and then they've got to lop off its bureaucratic and military aspects. But he forgot, or he didn't use the point that Marx made in immediately following that in that particular work on the Civil War in France. He said the few but important functions which would still remain for a central government were not to be suppressed as has been intentionally misstated. In other words, Marx is saying, as he did all along, and Engels and the SPGB, you've got to get control of the machinery of government, all these government departments, or the whole apparatus of it, including the armed forces, before you can do anything about introducing socialism. Now, my opponent makes a great point about the difference between Parliament and workers' councils, Soviets. He approves of workers' councils, the Soviets in Russia in 1917, the workers' councils in Germany in 1918, but ICC reject the idea of Parliament. They give three reasons. One, they're not going to wait for the majority of the workers to become socialist. Second, that instead of gaining control of the machinery of government and the armed forces, they are going to confront the armed forces of the capitalist state. But thirdly, they use this argument that Parliament is mystification. In decadent capitalism, they say, Parliament and elections are nothing but sources of capitalist mystification. Any participation in the parliamentary surplus can only reinforce this mystification in the eyes of the proletariat. There's a half-truth here. Of course the capitalist class use Parliament to mystify the workers. They use everything else. They use sport and religion. They use economics. Is this a reason why we shouldn't study economics? Because the capitalists put over, and I'll come back to another point later, they put over the Keynesian rubbish to the working class? Of course it isn't. The moral of that is that you study economics from the Marxist point of view, you understand capitalism. Now Marx, this particular question was put to Marx and Engels about whether Parliament was mystification. You'll find Engels writing, the revolutionary workers of the Latin countries have got into the habit of looking upon the franchise as a pitfall, as an instrument for government chicanery. Engels didn't say, like ICC, therefore don't use it. Engels went on to say, of course you use it. He quoted what Marx wrote. Marx wrote the preamble to the program of the French Workers' Party. And Marx noted that the franchise in France had hitherto been a means of deception, what ICC calls mystification. But Marx went on to say, not don't use it, Marx went on to say they are now, and I quote, transforming the franchise into an instrument of emancipation, which is, of course, exactly the case of the SPGB. But I'd like to say something else about this. My opponent draws a distinction between workers' councils, which he thinks are above this sort of thing, and Parliament, which isn't. He should read Lenin. Lenin, in State and Revolution, draws attention to the fact, this is 1917, that his political opponents were using the workers' councils, the Soviets, to bamboozle the workers. He said this: they have managed to pollute the Soviets after the manner of the most despicable middle-class parliaments. In other words, if you have got a working class who are not mature enough to resist it, they can be bamboozled anywhere, in political parties, in trade unions, on workers' councils, or anywhere at all. The only remedy for this is, of course, that the working class have got to understand socialism when they can no longer be bamboozled. Now, what my opponent said, it's got to be an armed struggle to confront capitalism and overthrow it. They call it world civil war. Well, don't be misled. Civil war is war. There's no distinction between the two. It's going to be fought, and I quote from them, by the armed workers' councils. There will be military advances and offences and a vague indication of invasions, sending armed detachments into this or that region, and they add to this, not making any concessions to nationalism or any pretended right to national self-determination. Well, let me remind you, while the SPGB says you've got to wait till the mass of your working class understands socialism, ICC says you don't wait. You move when some crisis happens like the present one. Well, if you are going to move while the workers are not ready, you are going to have workers all over the world who are nationalist and patriotic, peasants who want to seize the land and this sort of thing. And when ICC wages their war, they are going to have to fight these people. And they make one or two things perfectly clear. My opponent referred to the fact that there are countries where the peasants are in the majority. Quite true. Remember what Engels said, you've got to win over your peasants. ICC are not going to win over the peasants. They make a specific statement that when they have set up their workers' councils in the transition period, the peasants are not going to be allowed to share in power. In other words, your dictatorship is not going to be a majority, it's going to be, at least in those countries, a minority. But I would add further that they make it quite clear that this dictatorship of what they call the proletariat is going to be like Lenin's and like Louis Blanqui's, who invented the term, a dictation of a minority. ICC says, for example, that this will probably start in the third world countries. They say the workers and the peasants and others in the third world countries won't wait for the industrialized countries. In other words, it's going to start in those countries where the working class are not even in a majority. And their workers' councils are not going to let the peasants share in power. I quote from their pamphlet, Nation or Class, the workers would have to prevent the peasants from attempting to share power with the proletariat. In other words, it's going to be a minority dictatorship. They also say in the same pamphlet, it will be, quote, a section of the proletariat which seizes power. And it will be the most revolutionary workers, not all the workers. It will be the most revolutionary fractions of the working class. In other words, this is going to be a minority dictatorship. And they're going to be faced with all the problems that a minority dictatorship is facing. I now want to draw attention to something else about this transition period. Remember the Louis Blanqui's idea, you get your dictatorship of the proletariat in power, then they educate the working class. But ICC recognise that in their transition period there is going to be capitalism all over the world. I quote from that same pamphlet, the experience of Russia has shown that not only is the construction of socialism difficult in one country, it is actually impossible, and they underline impossible. As long as global capital exists, it will continue to dominate all the rhythms of production and consumption everywhere. So capitalism is going to exist all over the world while you've got your minority dictatorship of the part proletariat running things. What I'd like to ask ICC is how they're going to manage distribution when they have got capitalism all over the world. Marx made that very brilliant remark of his, you cannot have capitalist production and socialist distribution. You can't play football under cricket rules, in other words. I put the question to the ICC, they are going to hold down the peasants and the mass of the workers. What about the workers who strike when the next crisis happens in this transition? Are they going to impose an income policy to hold wages down? Are they going to suppress the trade unions? I would like an answer to this question. We've had references to the crisis. This is a particular notion of ICC, that capitalism now is quite different from what it used to be. They give abundant evidence of it. They refer to the wave of strikes, unemployment, that the capitalist class can't handle capitalism. They should learn something about capitalist history. Everything they mention shows that capitalism now is just what it always was. A real change did take place in 1914. London ceased to be the military and political centre of the capitalist world. It's moved over to Moscow, New York, Peking, Brussels, with the Third World and Middle East and the others fast coming up. But football used to be played only in England. It's now played all over the world. That doesn't mean the decay of football. It just means it's extended. Capitalism now has not changed essentially. It's behaving exactly as it's behaved in its 200 years of history. They believe that, they use the phrase, the crisis, the present one, is deepening, that it's permanent, that the capitalist class are unable to deal with it. As I say, they ought to first read their Marx, and they should also read their Lenin, and they should understand something about capitalist history. This idea about capitalist crises being permanent, it's an ancient idea. It was being held by people in 1848. It was held by Heinemann in the 1880s. It's not Marxist, and as I say, it's not even Leninist. Marx's statement on this was, there are no permanent crises. Even Lenin knew this. Lenin said, revolutionaries occasionally endeavour to furnish the proof that there is absolutely no way out of the crisis. This is a mistake. There is no such thing as a situation from which there is no way out. And if you look at the evidence that ICC give that the capitalist world is different now, as I say, all it proves is that capitalism is not different now. If they're worrying about great crises and depressions, let them look at the Great Depression, which lasted for over 20 years, the longest and in many respects the worst crisis British capitalism has ever had, from 1873 into 1895. It was in the middle of that Heinemann gave a date for the revolution. It was to be 1889, the centenary of the French Revolution, because it didn't happen. But also, there were capitalists who thought at that time, as ICC would say now, that already by the 1880s, capitalism was quite different. It wasn't the nice, smooth capitalism they thought existed at the beginning, quite an illusion. Some of those believed it. Let me quote for you from Lord Randolph Churchill, 1884. We are suffering from a depression of trade extending back to 1874. Did I say 1884? I said this. Extending back to 1874, 10 years of trade depression, and the most hopeful either among our capitalists or our artisans can discover no signs of a revival. Your iron industry is dead as mutton. Your coal industries are languishing. Your silk industry is dead, assassinated by the foreigner. Your woolen industry is in articulo mortis, gasping, struggling. Your cotton industry is seriously sick. The shipbuilding industry has come to a standstill. Turn your eyes where you will, survey any branch of industry you like, you will find signs of mortal disease. This was 1880s. So Heinemann had a very, very reasonable sort of case to say then, as it lasted 20 years, my God, capitalism's finished. ICC look at the present one, which is mild by comparison. The present crisis has lasted 4 years. Unemployment's 1.5 million. When unemployment rises to 4 or 5 million and the depression's lasted 20 years, they can say, well, look, there's something to take notice of. But they should also remember, as Marx showed, that just as crises happen, they pass away. There is no such thing as a permanent crisis. The same forces that bring them take them away. One of developing the same idea, that coming back, by the way, to this idea of Parliament, in a leaflet which ICC got out on this present debate, they make the statement, very much like the one my opponent made in his opening speech. He said that the SPGB believes in a peaceful parliamentary conquest of power by the working class, and that this is an expression of the weight of bourgeois ideology on the proletariat. Well, he ought to know, as Marx and Engels held the same idea, bourgeois ideology must have impressed Marx and Engels. in 1886, and this wasn't in their early inexperienced days, but right at the end, Engels wrote in his preface to Capital, 1886, Britain is a country where the inevitable social revolution might be effected entirely by peaceful and legal means. And he added, oh, by the way, Marx said the same about Holland. Engels added that Marx didn't rule out the possibility the capitalist class might stage a counter-revolution against this peaceful and legal takeover. But this is where the SPGB comes in. I said at the beginning, we've carried on. There's been a lot more things happened in the world since Marx and Engels died. We insist that you have got to, before you attempt to get power, you've got to win over the great mass of the population, and that it's a very slow business, but that there is no other way of doing this. But this, of course, includes all of the members of the working class, the police, the army, the soldiers in the army. They also can be won over. They are members of the working class. They don't live in some cloistered monastery unaware of what's happening in the world. Just the forces that will move the working class to take a more nearer approach to full class consciousness will affect the people in the army and navy. That they will realize, and I use a phrase that particularly, they will realize that they are only workers in uniform and that their effort should be brought onto the same side as the working class. But now, let's look at this a little realistically. Suppose you've got the situation which is absolutely essential. You've got the mass of the population who do understand socialism, know what they want, and are going to do it. How does the capitalist class stage a counter-revolution? My opponent used the phrase that it has got to be a war between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. Now tell me, how are the bourgeoisie on their own going to wage war or do anything else? Just imagine it. I mean, imagine a situation where all of these political, argumentative questions have been worked out, when the working class is mature and knows what it's doing, is internationally organized and knows all about it. Just imagine some representative of the capitalist class. I mean, the obvious one to take is the chairman of the Confederation of British Industries, saying to the workers, look, you know, you've got this all wrong. We really represent your interest, and we are going to stage an armed counter-revolution against the decision of the overwhelming mass of the population. I mean, they could be have a certain nuisance value, but otherwise it's a joke. The bourgeoisie cannot wage war without the working class. Working class in industry, working class in administration, working class in all the armed forces to do it for them. One other thing, in developing their own case, and you will have heard my opponent refer to it, they are going to rely on the crisis to bring the working class, so to speak, into taking revolutionary action. I've already mentioned the Great Depression. I notice in one of their things they talk about the wave of strikes. Most impressive. In the last 4 years, the number of days lost in strikes in this country is 31 million, very large figure. This is the work of 11 million trade unionists. In the 4 years, 1893 to 1896, when there were only 1.5 million trade unionists, only 1/7 of what there are now, they knocked up a total of 49 million days. So this ICC belief that it's the workers moving into revolutionary now because they're striking over wages and prices, if that were true, and of course it isn't, it's not the key to the situation at all, they've got to look back into the 1890s to find when the revolutionary situation really happened. And we say against this, you do not have a revolutionary situation because workers strike about wages and prices. The capitalist class can always give them some concession, and the what they call a revolutionary wave, which is a discontent wave, passes away. As it always has done. I mean, you saw this happening in the 19th century and so on. But capitalism has not changed essentially. Capitalism is just the same as it always was. It operates in precisely the same way that it always did. One of their cases is, it's part of the same argument, that the capitalist class cannot afford reforms anymore. ICC doesn't understand capitalism and doesn't understand how the capitalists afford reforms. A lot of the reforms the capitalists give or appear to give cost them nothing. probable that the health service and education have cost the capitalist class nothing because they've raised the productivity of the working class. But this is the key to the situation. While the productivity of the working class goes on rising, while the output of each worker rises a little year by year, as it has continued to do and is doing now, of course the capitalist class can afford to give part of it to the working class as a concession. If the working class output in a year raises 4%, of course the capitalist class, without losing anything, in fact gaining something, can give 2% to the working class. So this idea of the ICC that you can get a revolutionary situation out of discontent, crises and things like that is quite mistaken. I notice elsewhere, one of their statements is that capitalism now has nothing to offer except cycles of crises, wars and reconstruction. To the extent that it is true, of course, it's always true. When Louis Blanqui, their founder, their dictator of the proletariat, staged his first revolt in 1830, he could have said it then. He could have said in 1830, capitalism offers you nothing except a series of crises, wars and reconstructions. Marx and Engels were already writing in 1844 about the regular crises that had been happening in the capitalism. First one was in 1784, not 1884, 1784. Another in 1793. Heinemann, in his Commercial Crisis, lists 9 of them between 1850 and 1892. Capitalism always has crises, and as Marx says, none of them last forever. They all pass away. Reconstruction is not really important, but British capitalism had 2 major reconstructions in the 19th century. First, when it abandoned protection and went over to free trade in the middle of the century, and then in the 1880s and the Great Depression, when it started the reverse trend. I mean, this sort of thing is not really important. But also, they say capitalism offers you nothing but wars. When did capitalism ever offer the workers anything else but crises and wars? They say, Marx and Engels were already saying in the Communist Manifesto 1848, they referred to the bourgeoisie's constant battle with the bourgeoisie of other countries. In the 1914 war, Arthur Ponson, who published a book called Wars and Treaties, 1815 to 1914, he listed and described 42 wars in the 19th century, and he said it wasn't a complete record. I'll piece up, and he gave his explanation. He said most people, and he's writing in 1917, most people seem to think that there were hardly any wars before 1914. ICC seem to have the same impression if they think that capitalism has essentially changed in that respect. Another idea people do have, and apparently they've got it, is that the old wars are different. They were only little wars. They were not little wars. Look at some. Look at the Napoleonic Wars, lasted about 20 years. There were 6 million deaths in the Napoleonic Wars. If you allow for population, that was comparable with the First World War. Or look, their war is going to be a civil war. But as I said, don't be misled. People get killed in civil war just as in wars. Look at the American Civil War in the 1860s. The number of Americans who lost their lives in the American Civil War was more than America lost in the First World War and the Second World War taken together. And just one other example. In the 1850s, 60s, there was what were called the Taiping Wars in China. It was partly a peasant revolt. This ought to interest ICC. A peasant revolt to overthrow the Manchu dynasty, and they captured a large part of China. They were eventually crushed with the help of British and French troops. The estimated deaths in the Taiping Wars were between 20 and 30 million, with 100,000 people killed in Nanking alone. So what I'm asking you to recognize, in all this, the whole of this argument that capitalism is different is a complete myth. Capitalism is essentially the same as it always was. 1 minute. As I expected, I haven't been able to deal with all the things I want to. I'm hoping to deal in the following 10 minutes, the 10 minutes that come at the end, with another aspect of their war. They give you abundant evidence that they are going to lose their war when it takes place. I want to deal with this. I also want to deal with another important aspect. They claim to be Marxist, and I'm going to show from their own propaganda that not only do they not understand capitalism's crises and depressions, but that their claim to be Marxist betrays an almost total ignorance of Marxist economics. They also use another argument, another piece of complete myth. They say that what's going to provoke the present revolutionary situation is a shrinking world market. I hope to deal with that as well.
Yes.
Just two brief points, Comrade Chairman. I was disappointed to hear that the speaker for the ICC spent about half of his quoting what Marx said in 1844 and what Engels said in 1888. I'm not sure that that takes the working class of 1977 very far. The audience may or may not have noticed that while he was doing this, taking part in this steer-out game, he found himself quoting from Engels, where Engels says, yes, you can take over the parliament and the machine, you will have to lop off certain parts. This, of course, is something which the SPGP has quoted often enough. And our friend then, finding himself saying something which he didn't find to his own taste, I don't know why he quoted it, he then denounced Engels' contribution then and said, oh, well, that's no use at all. Well, if it's no use at all, why quote it? May I suggest to the ICC that they, whatever else they do tonight, they get hold of a copy of this month's Socialist Standard. Even if they have to steal it, they don't have to pay us for it. We won't guard it. And they will find a quotation in an article by Horatio, somebody called himself Horatio, which says, whatever Marx said in 1870, in 1977, the only way the working class will get socialism is by the democratic, in large capitals, political organisation for it. That is what the SPGB says. Marx and Engels grew up like other human beings, which is all they were, and they said plenty of things which we certainly don't agree with, and perhaps you don't agree with either. Let's deal with 1977 realities. The second point I just want to draw your attention to, because you may have missed that other one about the little fiddle with Engels. The second point is that I had to rub my eyes in disbelief when I heard the ICC speaker saying that the SPGB had disagreed with the revolution in Russia in 1917 because we said it was not a socialist revolution and we therefore were having none of it. Well, that's true. He's quite right. We did say that. We've said it ever since. Now, he is giving us some sort of model, some sort of illustration of what the ICC really are after. Because most of it, of course, was vague, airy-fairy stuff, and you cannot really tell from it how the working class was going to get power and get socialism. I mean, he was terribly vague about all that. Struggling and all that sort of thing are just words which have no real meaning unless you explain them. But he did give us a very illuminating insight into the way their minds work by saying that they not only disagreed with our opposition to the Russian Revolution as being non-socialist, but they still think it was a jolly good idea. Now, here is why I rub my eyes in disbelief. After 60 years of the most monstrous, totalitarian, state-capitalist brutality, that these people are going to celebrate the birthday of the revolution which has done more to betray socialism than anything else that's ever happened in the history of the world. We'll be celebrating it in mourning, my friend, and that's what you should be doing.
Yes.
I'd like to respond to that last point. The SPGB has clearly shown itself incapable of having learned anything since about 1904. This little attack at the beginning about quoting from history and then doing the same back in reply, let's forget it. It's what we were trying to do by presenting that historical basis is to show that of course there aren't any great heroes of the past who have got everything right, precisely because the class does learn through struggle. And as the speaker said, the experiences of the Paris Commune were lessons which it is absolutely vital that the proletariat then and continues to do, is to grasp. And we say exactly the same thing about the Russian Revolution. The SPGB completely wants to and not just the events in Russia, but the fact that there was a revolutionary wave throughout the vast part of the world around 1917, 1923. They completely ignore this because they look at the defeat of this in the same way that all sorts of various Maoists and communists will look at it and say, well, look at now, look at Russia today. Well, that proves that nothing happened in 1917. This is because you have no conception of the power of the bourgeoisie. When you talk about when all the workers are suddenly transformed into socialists, the bourgeoisie will curl its tail up and go away, you don't understand the way the bourgeoisie constantly attacks the class, and it is attacking it today. And as the class gets stronger and stronger in struggle today, it has to wheel out more and more left-wing teams precisely to attack the class. Not because the class is somehow absolutely cretinous and it votes for the Labour Party because it's stupid. It votes for the Labour Party because it in a confused way believes it is socialist. The workers are looking for something which pushes socialism. The mystifications about Russia and Russia being a worker state, it has a tremendous power for the bourgeoisie to use this mystification precisely because the class is a revolutionary class. And as the workers in this country struggle more, the government here is going to have to put a more left-wing team in precisely to attack the class. It is going to have to make the trade unions appear more left-wing in order to attack the class. And somehow these things are all irrelevant. That because we're not at the point of revolution, the working class is somehow not revolutionary. The bourgeoisie has to use all the weapons of leftism to attack the class, precisely because the class all the time is pushing forward with what will be its revolutionary struggle in the future. And you're, I can think, ignoring the role of trade unions, somehow you don't worry about the attacks that go on at the class, you don't worry about the leftist evening. You just sit here quietly saying that one day things are going to happen, folks. And you're going to be swept away on that process. Absolutely, unless you really start to reappraise the lessons of the last 50 years.
Yes. The power of the bourgeoisie, again, is a piece of sheer myth so far as the ICC are concerned. They have no power except that insofar as it is endorsed by the working class in their lack of socialist understanding. This is what sanctions the continuation of the capitalist class and their rule, not some power possessed by the capitalist class of themselves. And when the workers cease to endorse their master's system, there will be no more power of the bourgeoisie. And let's be clear from the contributor at the back that the purpose of capturing Parliament is not just to dismantle the state machine, it's so that having got control of the political fountainhead of class power, only from this vantage point can the capitalist class be dispossessed of their anti-social ownership of the means of production and distribution. Only in this way, through stripping the capitalist class and making the means of production communal property, can society start on the new basis of common ownership with production for use and socialism be installed. That's the purpose of capturing Parliament, not to dismantle the state machine first of all. That's not the purpose. But if we listen to the contributor from ICI over here, I'm sorry if I've got the initials wrong. ICI do make quite similar sounding noises. They claim that because the state, the present political institutions of government and parliament are formulated to serve the capitalist class, they are bourgeois institutions, they are no good for the workers. Well, if they follow the absurdity of this sort of Alice in Wonderland logic, literacy was organised and brought about by the bourgeoisie, so likewise this can be no use for the working class. They should stop reading because they're using a tool given them by the capitalist class. Modern industry and modern science, the whole historical foundation upon which socialism will be built, the material basis which makes it possible, was developed by capitalism, but because it was brought about by capitalism and it has served the capitalist class very well through the exploitation of wage labour, likewise we must have nothing to do with this. What nonsense. The reason why the state machine today serves the capitalist class is because their ideas predominate in society And therefore, obviously, the institutions, backed up by the working class in their political ignorance in the majority, continue to serve the capitalist class. Given a change in that those ideas, so that the majority of the working class understand and want socialism, of course they will use Parliament to strip the capitalist class, and then proceed to use those modern instruments of science and technology to serve the end no longer of profit production, but of meeting the needs freely of people in society. So far as the speakers of ICC's contribution was concerned, 5 points of agreement. Of course, there are no points of agreement if you reject the only means of attaining socialism. Let's have no illusions about this. If you reject the only means of attaining socialism, ultimately you must reject socialism itself, and that is precisely the position you are in. No takeover of the state machine means no socialism, and ICC's whole contribution was bogged down in the simple mechanics of how the revolution takes place. The question of the abolition of the state machine and whether the workers are going to, as in his Soviet fatherland of state capitalist Russia, form their own state machine under Lenin, so that the workers today, 60 years later, are faced with this hideous monstrosity on their plates. This is what they are now confronted with, and this is what they've got to capture and get rid of, the state of Soviets which they endorsed. I would refer him to The Origin of the Family, Private Property in the State, where Engels points out that the state is not abolished, it withers away, and that when the barometer of universal franchise reaches boiling point, this is the time for social change, because this is the indicator par excellence that the working class in the majority are ready for a total change in society. What lies behind the quest for political power must be the political consciousness of a working class. If the ICC hold that Russia in 1917 was a workers' revolution indeed, with 85% illiterate peasants, of course they are in cloud cuckoo land and up the creek without a paddle, no wonder their confusion. Even Lenin, who they claim reaffirmed Marx did no such thing, he claimed that state capitalism would be a step forward for backward reactionary Russia. I challenge his misquotations and references to Marx, where he said Marx urged workers to smash the state. Give chapter and verse and the page and reference, and read the actual quotation where Marx ever said smash the state machine. The reference in the Civil War in France, Marx did not say smash the state. He was talking about the Paris Commune, and he pointedly said, as the Comrade Hardy has pointed out, the question of simply taking a hold of the ready-made state machine that they were confronted with. They had to first lop off the old bureaucracy and the armed forces, because this was what gave it its bourgeois character, nothing to do with smashing it at all. And again, you're supporting the Leninist Soviets, who rebuilt the most militaristic and most bureaucratic state machine the world had ever seen. The ICI concept, therefore, of revolution as one of cannon and bayonets, may I emphasise with the contributor at the back, who's spent her plea downing the left, this emphasis of the revolution, I'm putting it in, counting it in terms of cannon and bayonet, echoes the sympathies of the woolly-headed so-called Socialist Workers' Party and the Rest in Peace so-called Revolutionary Workers' Party up the road here, all of the muddled Trotsky fraternity. The only way to avoid this nonsense of Lenin and his heavy civil war, which will inevitably lead to the mass bloodshed and slaughter of the workers, putting some other Leninist, Trotskyist minority into power on the backs of the working class, the only way this massacre can be avoided is to gain control of the coercive state, from which organised violence in the modern world ultimately generates as the sanction of the political power of the capitalist class. And to talk about the epoch of capitalist decay, this of course again goes with Lenin, and it's about as decadent as Leninism is. What evidence is there for capitalism in decay? The only time capitalism can be thought of as being in decay is when the working class in their majority cease to sanction its continuation, and until they do that, it will continue until the idea of the abolition of the wages system crystallises in the heads of the workers. It won't be a question of going to Parliament to decree anything. A decree in Parliament won't abolish the wages system. It first and this is the whole point they've missed and failed to understand all the way through everything, is that Parliament doesn't decree the abolition of the wages system. First, it must take place in workers' heads, and all Parliament does is carry out what has already taken place in the revolution in workers' ideas and workers' thinking. And of course, this very much applies with a vengeance to the backwoodsmanship of ICC.
Question at the back. Contribution at the back.
Talk about the SPPB and Parliament, and I'd also like to talk about the decay of capitalism and the ascendancy of capitalism. To begin with, as the speaker from the ICC pointed out in his opening remarks, the SPGB came to life as a result of making a formal break with the Second International. We all remember in the Second International, parties of the working class were organized on the basis of sending delegates to Parliament. Mandated delegates from the working class were to fight for the provision of a revolutionary tribune within Parliament in order to provide a focus of propaganda for the working class, to attempt to explain to the working class how capitalism had nothing to offer it, and that the overall fight of the working class must be for the abolition of capitalism and the construction of socialism. Now, in the 19th century, when the Second International had this particular tactic, it could also fight in Parliament for reforms. And I'm talking about the reforms of an 18, 19-hour day with miners in the mines wearing silver chains and being tied to the mine wall down in the mine at night, and a reform of not having 5, 6, 7-year-old little children, and not having women, pregnant women, the lot, all doing heavy manual work, but instead to actually reduce the working day from 18, 19 hours a day to 10 and then till 8. All of these reforms were fought for by the working class, creating trade unions and creating social democratic type parties which went to Parliament to fight this struggle, not on behalf of the working class, but to give a voice to the actual struggle of the class striking against these appalling conditions. When this happened in the 19th century, those were real reforms for the working class. The actual, the difference between a little kid who's been sent to the mines at the age of 5 or 6, growing up without a bent back when he's 20, and if he goes down the mines when he's 16, 17, 18, or 19, is an enormous difference. He could also be sent to school, or factory legislation passed, etc., etc. I'm sure you're all aware of them. In the 20th century, however, why we maintain that capitalism is in decay is not only that the entire capitalist system convulses, where the question isn't whether America sent X number of men to fight the First World War. The question is that the American economy, the English economy, the German economy, in sum, the total world economy was convulsed by a world war. A world war which inaugurated a period of war or revolution, absolutely fundamentally seen by the revolutionaries of that day and by the working class of that day, which was precisely why not a wave of discontent swept the world in 1917, but actually a real authentic class struggle against capitalism. Now, if we examine this process, we look at those same people from the Second International, the Social Democrats in Germany in 1918, going to Parliament. Now, the SPGB is going to say, well, we started company with them in 1904, thank you very much, and we don't do the same thing, and that they were well-intentioned people, or maybe they weren't. Perhaps between 1903, when we were with them, and then in 1918, they stopped being well-intentioned, and therefore, when they went to Parliament to talk about socialism and getting socialism through the parliamentary struggle, they'd lost their good intentions, because when they unleashed the shock troops of the German army that had been built up in the First World War, who later became the Free Corps, which later became the core troops of the SS in Hitler's Germany, when the Social Democratic Party unleashed them against the working class in 1918 and 1919, when Parliament, in other words, was the rallying ground for the bourgeoisie against the workers' councils, which the workers in strike had set up to direct their own struggles. When the workers in the Ruhr set up their workers' councils to organize their own workers' militias, they were fighting the very troops sent against them by the bourgeois parliament, by parliamentary democracy, by the social democracy. Similarly, if we talk about reforms in this particular century, we can look at all sorts of different examples. One of them is this, that in the general strike in France in the 1930s, in 1936, the workers went out on strike for the 40-hour work week. What did they go out and strike for in 1968? They were fighting for the 40-hour work week again. There is a massive difference between working 19 hours a day in the 19th century and fighting and getting a 10-hour day, and in the 20th century starting a fight 40 years ago for the 40-hour work week, which ended with the workers in France being mobilized for the Second World War behind democratic capitalism, under the Popular Front, under the whole mystification that there's one wing of capitalism that still can be used, that Parliament still can be used, that there's something in defending parliamentary democracy, that it's better than fascism, that it's somehow better than a lot of other things. And Stalinism is a good defense of democracy as well. I'd like to talk about how the SPGB's track record on these two world wars, which our speaker from the SPGB began by saying, well, yes, capitalism, nothing much changes under capitalism. I mean, the trade unions have changed between the 19th century and today, but capitalism is still a system that has crisis, reconstruction, and war, and it's always had these kinds of crises, and the ICC is a bit naive if it's just found out about them, because in the 19th century, a lot of people got killed in war, etc. The difference that we maintain is that the entire system in the 20th century is convulsed by war. War never stopped. That is why we say there's absolutely nothing in it for the working class to support national liberation struggles. It's a question of a little country in Africa going from the American orbit into the Russian orbit. No. That there is absolutely nothing but barbarism in this century for the working class. And we would disagree very much with our honored friend when he says that nothing much has changed under the sun for capitalism, except the working class from day one has remained too dumb to see what the brilliant people who are not going to substitute themselves for the class when they get into Parliament, as the social democracy did, because they are going to have honor. They're going there as socialists who are going to put into practice what the consciousness of the working class tells them to put into practice. What I want to ask this meeting is, how is it that in the past, the working class, why didn't it get this consciousness? How does it get this consciousness? Does it get this consciousness from its struggle against the exploitation of capitalism, whereby it learns how to organize itself in a period where reforms are possible in trade unions, in a period when reforms are no longer possible in autonomous strike committees, which automatically go up against the state, which automatically come up against it. It seems to me that to malign the Russian Revolution, and again we're talking about, you cannot have, if you're looking for communism before it's happened, you're not going to find it. And if you look back to the Russian Revolution, expecting to find communism before it could happen, you're not going to find it either. What we're saying about October 1917 is that it is the grandest manifestation of the working class organizing itself to A, end a capitalist war, inaugurate a revolutionary wave, which posed the working class answer to the decay of capitalism, either revolution or continued world war. And after the working class revolution was defeated, and defeated precisely because parties of the working class as a whole, didn't understand the relationship of the parties with the class, we got a whole other cycle, and we're going into another one, of continued war. For the SPGB, it's just a question of going out in the street corner and selling a few more magazines. And if the war comes, well, too bad, we'll take up a virtual pacifist position like we did in the Second World War when we agreed to publish our magazine as long as we kept away from the whole dicey issue of saying, as left communists said in the Second World War, turn the imperialist war into a civil war. That was the communist position, and that, unfortunately, means violence.
I call upon Alan Ward to close for the ICC.
Right, well, it's impossible in 10-15 minutes to sum up all the differences that have come up, so I'll just concentrate on what seem to have been the main ones. And that seems to be basically the problem of the state and the relationship of the working class to the state, and the problem of the way the working class becomes conscious. The SPGB speaker posed the question to the ICC, seriously posed the question, do we think the workers are unable to develop beyond a trade union consciousness? In other words, do we accept Lenin's view that expressing what is to be done, that the working class cannot go beyond this stage unless there's an intervention of some outside force which instills it with socialist consciousness? Everything we've said in this meeting must indicate the opposite to this, that we think the working class is the revolutionary class in this society, that it can develop a revolutionary consciousness, and that it can itself emancipate itself, it can itself take political power and hold it, and also it can itself create a socialist society. Do we want, was another question, a repeat of October, in the sense that October represented at that moment the expression of the working class, the highest level that the working class had reached at that period? Yes. In the sense that the working class, in the way the working class organised itself, there are many mistakes that the working class inevitably made in that period because of its own immaturity. The working class in 1917, the class as a whole, its parties, the Bolsheviks, the Spartacists in Germany, had the same illusions that the SPGB has today. That in the revolution, whether it takes place through parliament or through Soviets, the workers have to delegate power to a party. This was one of the fundamental errors of the Russian Revolution. Given the isolation of the Russian Revolution, it was bound to degenerate and to turn into state capitalism. The tragedy was, because the party had taken over state power, that it became the organizer of the counter-revolution. A party which had been a proletarian party was forced to become the massacre of the working class. And this is the great tragedy and sorrow of the Russian Revolution, which the SPGB is unable to feel because it had nothing to do with the Russian Revolution. One speaker even claimed that the Soviets set up this monstrous totalitarian regime in Russia. This is a slander against the Soviets. The tragedy of the Russian Revolution, again, was that the Soviets were crushed by the counter-revolution. The working class was deprived of its own democratic organs by the counter-revolution and wiped out. And it was then that the horrible regime that arose could really get underway. But this was even happening from the early years of the revolution. And we don't hide any of the mistakes that the Bolsheviks party made during these years. We say that working class never again can delegate power to a minority, whether it calls itself a violent or a peaceful minority. It must wield power itself through its own mass organs of struggle. The point is, some people seem to think, well, why can't it do it through Parliament? Parliament is democratic. Surely this can express the mass democratic political action of the working class. And the one speaker brought up the question of the feudal state, and if we were now 400 years back talking about how to build capitalism, we would argue, or the Capitalist Party of Great Britain, as it would be, would have argued that we must take over the bourgeois state. Of course, he would have been right. The bourgeoisie could take over the old state machine because its revolution, although progressive in that time, was simply the changeover from one form of exploiting society to another form of exploiting society. And the state didn't really have to change. It could just be taken over. It was still a state which was used to oppress a majority by a minority. The working class revolution is entirely different. The working class does not have the aim of setting up a new exploiting society, but of abolishing exploitation. Therefore, the state, which it has to use as a transitional step towards abolishing the state and abolishing classes, cannot be the old state, which is entirely geared to the oppression of a majority by the minority. A new form of state has to be set up, which expresses the will of the majority against the minority. And this was the kind of state that was set up in the Paris Commune and the kind of state that was set up in Russia. One of the lessons of the Russian Revolution was not that the workers couldn't make a revolution. The problem of the Russian Revolution, in a sense, highlighted the problem that faces the working class as a whole today. Because however widely you define the working class, even if you extend it to the breadth that the SPGB does, to the fact that anyone who has a wage is a worker, the working class is still a minority of the world's population. Peasants are not workers. People who have never been involved in production are not workers. And the problem the working class will face is how to integrate this massive humanity into socialist production. It cannot do it through violence. On the other hand, it must exert a domination over these strata. It must be able to convince them of the need for socialism by being able to give them material things. But it means that it also must have behind it the power to defend its revolution if it should be attacked by the peasants or whatever. Violence can only be the first step of revolution. No one is saying in the ICC that socialism will be created through violence. On the contrary, we make no bones about advocating the violent overthrow of the bourgeoisie and of its state by the working class. But violence cannot be the method through which socialism is constructed. Socialism is the creation of a society, a new society on a world scale. And the working class as a whole, the majority of the working class or the whole working class will exercise this political power. And it will integrate humanity into itself, and that is the very process of socialism. But it's no good, as the SPGB does, wishing away this problem by saying that once the working class has the power, it will be in the majority, no one will stand in its way. Even when the working class does have power, it will find many forces still in its way. The point about the parliamentary state that it is not democratic. It cannot be used for socialism. It cannot be used to convince the rest of the population of the need for socialism. It is a bourgeois machine which can only serve the bourgeoisie. In order to democratically convince the whole of the world's population of the need for socialism, an entirely new form of state is necessary. The other point, which I'll try and deal with very briefly, is the problem of class consciousness. And as many of my comrades have said, the SPGB does not understand the way class consciousness develops. You can see this by the fact that it really seriously believes that you can gauge class consciousness by who the workers vote for. But workers who one day vote Labour or even Conservative can the next day be involved in radical struggles which teach them in one day much more than they've learnt in the whole of their lives under capitalism. And this is the secret of the class struggle, that it's learnt through the struggles of the class, the real struggles, and not through the atomization of the class in the pathetic farce of bourgeois elections. In 1905, 1 year after the foundation of the SPGB, the working class was 100 years ahead of the SPGB when it formed the Soviets in Russia. And the SPGB has never been able to catch up with the working class on that fundamental lesson. Someone argued that the working class, all these movements have been defeated, and that revolutionaries who advocated civil war against the bourgeois, against the imperialist war, were thrown in prison, as though defeat has been something which convinced the working class that their struggle was in vain, as though the fact that a struggle is defeated should convince us that this is not the road to struggle. The working class, as Rosa Luxemburg pointed out, will come conscious of the need of socialism through a whole series of defeats. That is the tragedy, in a sense, of the working class, but it is also the promise of a future of socialism, because it can learn through its defeats. It can learn through what happened in the Russian Revolution, so it doesn't happen again. And so that the next time the proletariat takes power, it will not give power to a party. It will not confuse state capitalism with socialism, and so on and so forth. The socialist revolution, whether the SPGB like it or not, is not, as Marx put it, a question of what this or that proletarian, or even the proletariat as a whole, may imagine for the moment to be the aim. It is a question of what the proletariat actually is, and what it will be compelled to do historically as the result of this being. The aim and the historical action of the proletariat are laid down in advance, irrevocably and obviously, in its own situation in life, and in the whole organization of contemporary bourgeois society. The class struggle which is breaking out now, the strikes and uprisings of the class all over the world, do allow revolutionaries to say that the working class is developing its consciousness. Any number of elections can't allow us to say this. And this is why, when the socialist revolution, which is maturing now, will catch the SPGB unawares. It's the SPGB who will be faced with the choice of being a club, because it's they who will be 100 years behind the class by telling it to vote for parliament when it's already out in the streets and forming councils and assemblies. And it's the revolutionaries, like the International Communist Current, who will be in the streets and in the assemblies, with the working class as a whole, pointing the way forward to socialism. And the question facing the SPGB is, where will it be then? Will it be on the side of the working class in the Soviets, or will it be on the side of the bourgeoisie, arguing for the restoration of the farce of bourgeois democracy? That is the choice that history will pose for the SPGB.
Well, Mr. Chairman, a lot of... There are, as my opponent said, there are a lot of things to deal with. One of the things that arose in his last contribution is that, again, this point. Engels said, unlike the early Engels and Marx, who were Blanquists, the mature Engels and Marx said, you've got to win over these people first. If you don't, you've got to go back to the original Blanquist idea, the dictatorship of the proletariat. You have a minority armed dictatorship. And what my opponent didn't answer, I did put the question to him, I can no doubt believe he hadn't got time with so many things, when you've got your minority dictatorship holding down peasants and holding down a lot of workers, what's going to be your basis of distribution? You're going to have the wages system. You're going to have capitalism. They agree quite frankly that it's going to be world capitalism they're running. How are they going to run this without themselves coming into conflict with the peasants and the working class, just as, of course, Lenin and the Bolsheviks did in Russia? On this question of parliament, I'd have to repeat this, there's a lot of complete inability to see the point of what Marx said and what the SPGB said about parliament. It isn't you want to get parliament because it is or is not democratic. This has nothing to do with it. The question is you have got to get control of the organised force of society. And if it can be got, as Marx and Engels said it could, in a country like England or Holland, through Parliament, that is how you do it. But the essence of it is not that it's parliamentary, but that you've got control of the machinery of government and the armed forces. And if you don't do that, there's nothing you can do. Hence Marx's statement about force being the midwife of society. He says the only force that matters, the only force that counts, is control of the machinery of government and the armed forces. If you, my opponent raises various questions. He's raised about the workers' councils, the Soviets in Russia, the workers' councils in Germany and so where. Who crushed these workers' councils? The people who controlled the machinery of government and the armed forces. Those are the people who crushed them. Actually, Russia is a peculiar case. I mentioned to you earlier, Engels saying Russia's the one country where Blankism would work because of the peculiar structure of the Russian state. This was borne out, in fact, where Trotsky, writing up the lessons of the revolution immediately afterwards, said there was one thing alone that made it possible in Russia, and it would not happen elsewhere. He said it would be completely different if they hadn't been faced with an army that did not want to fight, a peasant army that wanted to go home. This was what made the thing different in Russia. You got your Blankist revolution, and they could not introduce socialism. How on earth could they? But they practiced the deception. And you see, my opponent skates over this. They approve. He repudiated one thing. He said that he didn't agree with Lenin, that the workers are incapable of understanding socialism, although this is, of course, was the whole basis of Lenin's policy. I mean, this is what he worked on. But he skated over the other thing. Did Lenin or did he not believe they could introduce socialism in Russia in 1917? USSR, why call it the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics? It was a piece, either a piece of mental muddle on Lenin's part, or it was a piece of deliberate deception. It was probably a bit of both. In State and Revolution, Lenin quoted that passage that he said in the 1870s, a witty German said that the German post office is an example of socialism, Bismarck's post office. Lenin said, this is very true, this is bloody nonsense. Of course it wasn't. Engels had pointed out about the same people who said that's an example of socialism, that it was a spurious sort of socialism. Now, why did Lenin do this? Why did Lenin pretend that they were getting socialism in Russia at a time when, in 1917, when the ICC were agreeing with them? It was a piece of deception. About the state in general, of course, again I repeat, as Engels said in the Civil War in France, you've got to get control of the state machine, and then you change it. You lop off certain things and you retain others. You'll find it in the SPGB's Declaration of Principles. Turn it from an instrument of oppression into an agent of emancipation. And there is simply no other way in which you are going to do it. My opponent in his last contribution said they're going to have a new form of state. But as they have shown in their literature, their new form of state is going to be this minority armed dictatorship in the transition. Why do they suppose they can do something in their transition that they agree that Lenin couldn't do in Russia? Lenin made this absurd, it's very difficult to believe. He presumably had read Marx's criticism of the Gotha program, whereas I said before, Marx made this statement, if you have capitalist production, you must have capitalist distribution. Attlee, by the way, shared the same illusion of Lenin's. Attlee said when they got a Labour government, they're going to abolish the rich and the poor. Lenin said they were all going to be paid on one wage. The whole of Russia was going to do equal work and equal pay. Now, are the ICC going to try to do the same thing? If so, they will fail. Like Lenin failed, it simply cannot be done. How then are they going to educate the workers under their dictatorship? I mean, it seems to me to be a question that they haven't faced. Question was raised as who are the working class? Well, again, Marx gave a very good answer to this. Marx said that all the people are working class who stand in this value relationship, this employer-employee relationship to capitalism. And he didn't leave any bones about it. He didn't say, as ICC seems to think, that it's only the productive workers. As Marx pointed out, productive workers is a historical conception, that it used to mean a worker who made something with his hands. Then it became an organisation where you brought your architect, a special architect, to work the organisation. And thirdly, Marx said, a productive worker is any worker who produces property for the capitalist class. Not produce it in the state of creating labour, but of actually putting profit into the hands of the capitalist class. And as Marx pointed out, in case you should have any doubt about it, he dealt with the bank clerks and the commercial class, and he said they're all exploited, they're all giving unpaid labour. And he dealt with one of his cases of a capitalist who invested his money in a private school. And Marx said of the schoolmaster there, he is, and I quote, a productive labourer. The whole of these people are members of the working class, and for the same reason, they will realise not just that they're exploited, this is not the only thing, this is one of them, a lot of workers now feel that they're exploited, they will realise that they have got to recreate society. Now, this raises this question, which has already been dealt with. I'd like to say just a little about it. Can the workers understand socialism? Or rather, how do they come to understand socialism? Well, it's already been pointed out, you don't learn about socialism merely by being in a struggle. A lot of the struggles of the trade unions are merely repetitions. It's like seeing the old play over and over and over again. You only learn out of a struggle if you develop ideas, if some idea comes out of it. Well, here, of course, the Marx and Engels works and the SPGB can help them. But if they don't develop ideas out of their struggle, then they don't learn anything. And I'm sure, shock my opponents. They throw out this question that we seem to think that workers' ideas change individually. Indeed, we do. I don't know any other way. I don't share the view of the Baptists. You take 100 people at a time and drop them in a river and they're all converted. People do change their ideas one by one, and there is no other way of doing it. The struggle may give them the incentive to look into the question, but it is one by one that they understand. Now, what the workers have got to understand, they've got to understand the structure of capitalism and its economic laws and the nature of its crises. And once they understand it, they will reject this ICC idea that capitalism's crises have become different. Capitalism's crises have not become different. They've merely become larger scale with more people involved in it over a larger area of the world's surface. There was a statement made that the IMG and CPGB had the same attitude to Parliament as the SPGB. It's news to me. I've never heard the SPGB say to the workers, go and elect Labour MPs to Parliament, or elect Churchill to Parliament as the Communist Party did. No. The SPGB has always said to the workers, look, the one thing you must not do, you must not put your class enemies in charge of the machinery of government and the armed forces. That's what the SPGB has said. IMG and the Communist Party are not in that category at all. One reference was made that we seem to have no idea of the power of the bourgeoisie. Indeed, we have. We not only understand the magnitude of the power and their resourcefulness, their ability to get round all of these, what the ICC regards as revolutionary waves. Even Engels in 1880 had a mental aberration for a little while. He said, we're almost on the point of the unemployed taking things into their own hands. They didn't, because that crisis passed. The unemployed don't take things into their own hand now because the capitalists were ingenious enough to develop an unemployment system. But again, I repeat that it's the power that matters, not the fact that it is or is not called a parliament. Now, my opponent rather skated over this idea about the war the ICC are going to wage. He said they're not going to do it. It's going to be the workers, and they don't like violence. They would keep it as little as possible. Well, it does seem to me that he is minimizing this. I read in the pamphlet Nation and Class, page 48, in Argentina in 1969, the workers defended their neighborhood against the army with Molotov cocktails and guns, organizing committees to coordinate their fight, which can be seen to be the direct precursors of the workers' councils. Molotov cocktails and guns and so on. What's happened to this Argentine struggle now? 1969, 8 years ago, the people who control the machinery of government and the armed forces in the Argentine have almost strangled these people who were on the verge of a revolutionary wave, because it isn't a revolutionary wave, it was merely a wave of discontent. But on their war, I want to point out that they are going to wage a war. They call it worldwide civil war, and they are going to lose it. And they tell you so. They tell you that it's going to be armed councils and all over the place, but they give a pledge. They pledge themselves, and I quote, not to go in for the bombing and shelling of residential districts. These people are going to raise a war. And what do they think the other side are going to do? The other side are going to move their artillery, their mobile artillery, their rocket launchers into residential districts, and I assure ICC there won't be any referee to whom they can appeal and say that's a foul. They think they're going to wage this war, and they're going to lose it. They give another pledge. They said they will not use nuclear weapons or bacteriological warfare. Incidentally, by the way, if they say they're not going to use bombing planes and artillery against residential districts, they're at least giving an implication that they think they're going to get bombing planes and artillery. And one wonders where they're going to get them from. But they're not going to use nuclear warfare or bacteriological warfare, or, I quote, any other nightmarish techniques of mass murder. Well, it's a great tribute to their humanitarianism, but humanitarianism and war do not mix. And incidentally, it's extremely muddled. Do they really suppose that a man who has his guts torn out with a bayonet or an explosive shell likes it any better than if he's killed with a nuclear bomb or by a bomb or an aircraft? It's a piece of muddled thinking. But now let me remind you of this. Who are the people who possess all the weapons, the bacteriological warfare, the nuclear weapons, the shells, the bombing planes? It is the people who control the machinery of government and the armed forces. So when ICC say that, they are saying to you that you're going to fight this war for nothing because you're going to be defeated. You're going to fight it on terms which make it absolutely unrealistic, and all for nothing. 2 minutes. I would come back to, in the remaining 2 minutes, again to a question about war. We say this. We say members of the working class in uniform are just like any other members of the working class. Unlike Lenin's belief that they're incapable of understanding things, they can understand, they can see what capitalism is through their experience, and when the thing is explained to them. But the SPGB, therefore, is going to get the working class to recognize their class position under normal conditions along with the other workers. ICC, as you will see, are also believe that you can win the workers over by saying you're workers in uniform. But they're going to pitch Molotov cocktails at them and shoot them first. And at some stage they're going to say, soldier, you've got it all wrong. You're on our side. Well, it seems absolutely insane to me. If you can do it at all, you do it under normal conditions. One other thing, ICC claim to be Marxist. I've shown they don't understand Marxist view, the real view of capitalism's crises and so on. But they also do not understand Marxian economics at all. They deal, incidentally, not very fully, they deal with inflation. They don't understand it. They say the bourgeoisie is afraid of inflation and afraid of deflation. Haven't they ever recognized what Marx pointed out, that the capitalist class are divided? One section of the capitalist class wants inflation, the borrowers of money, the industrial capitalists, and the other lot want deflation, the financial people and the lenders of money. So it is not the bourgeoisie as a whole having a view on this. See, ICC uses the argument, since they're afraid of inflation, afraid of deflation, they're impotent and can do nothing. Are they unaware that in capitalist history, about 40 times the bourgeoisie has dealt with inflation. The last time they dealt with it in this country was in 1919, which is since their watershed date for capitalism of 1914. They just told the Bank of England not to print any more notes. But ICC hadn't understood this. They used the phrase that the bourgeoisie are afraid to deal with it by restriction of credit. In other words, they've fallen for the Keynesian rubbish, the stuff that Marx dealt with. Marx dealt particularly with this. He said, if you want to see the ignorance of the vulgar economists, it's their belief that capitalism's expansions and contractions have something to do with the contraction and expansion of credit. And he said, they're not the cause, they're merely a symptom of it. I put a final question at the end. In this transition period, when ICC are going to educate the workers, what are they going to do? Give them this Keynesian rubbish, which is their own rubbish, or are they going to try to get the workers to understand capitalism, which is what they ought to be doing?